It's not enough to go into a place and say, all right, well, now there are 3% believers. We can leave and go on to the next one. We need to stay and labor.
Well, welcome back to Civically Minded, where I give you practical theology for everyday life. As always, I'm your host, Corey Wing. Did you know that all my interview segments are being added now to my audio podcast on Apple and Spotify? Simply search for Civically Minded and enjoy solid Christian content on your long commute, maybe at your desk or at the gym, or wherever you prefer to listen to your podcast. And be sure to tell a friend how they also can enjoy Civically Minded. Well, my guest today is the Director of Communications and Engagement at the ABWE, and I'll let him explain what that is in just a little bit. His work involves enhancing the agency's global work of spreading the gospel through strategic communication efforts. Alex holds a Master of Arts in Media and Communication Studies and a Bachelor of Science in Biblical Studies from Liberty University. He's also served as an evangelism and apologetics instructor at Liberty University Online from 2012 to 2014. He's a prolific writer, speaker, and author, having contributed to Christian sites such as 9 Marks, the Gospel Coalition, and Founders Ministries. His writing often explores the intersection of theology with culture and mission, emphasizing the symbiotic relationship between sound doctrine and effective evangelism. He's the author of Striving for the Faith, A Journey Through Philippians for Life on Mission, and he co-authors Missions by the Book, How Theology and Missions Walk Hand in Hand, which examines the relationship between doctrine and mission methodology. Alex hosts 2 podcasts with the ABWE called The World View and Cloud of Witnesses. And he co-hosts a podcast called The Missions Podcast, which delves into various aspects of missions and evangelism. Alex also resides in York, Pennsylvania, with his wife and 4 children, and serves as an elder and a staff member at Faith Bible Fellowship Church. It's my pleasure to welcome to Civically Minded, Alex Kocman. Welcome, buddy.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me, Corey.
I'm very happy to have you. I was saying offline, I'm very familiar with the ABWE. My 91-year-old grandmother and my mother, who's both are now widows, both still give to ABWE missionaries. And I grew up in a denomination that's very, at the time at least, was very aligned with the ABWE. And so when I first heard about what you do and your association with them, I was like, heck yeah. For my world, this just feels right. So why don't you, that's right. Why don't you tell my audience a little bit about, what the ABWE is, what that stands for, what it is, and kind of what your role with the organization is.
Yeah, it's hard to tell what it stands for without telling a little bit of the history.
Sure.
The acronym is Association of Baptists for World Evangelism. About 100 years ago, when the Northern Baptists were going liberal, we've all heard of Southern Baptists. There's Northern Baptists as well. When they were going liberal, when they were slipping into modernism and denying the resurrection, those sorts of things. Around that era, there was one medical missionary in the Philippines by the name of Dr. Raphael Thomas. He was a soul winner. He was a prolific evangelist. He was also a medical doctor. He was working in a hospital there. And the Northern Baptists were going woke. They were encouraging him. They're actually holding him accountable to stop doing so much evangelism and focus just on social justice, mercy ministry. He said no, and he formed a separate, independent, Baptistic mission agency. And sent himself back with his supporters, his churches, to the field in order to be committed to evangelism and church planting. And so that's been in our DNA for about the last almost century by the grace of God. Today, we're ministering in 91 countries. We have about 1,000 workers. I have the great privilege of celebrating and serving those missionaries by telling their story. But as far as what we do, if one of your listeners is from kind of the Southern Baptist world, we try and do all the things that a healthy missions agency does, but not just for SBC churches or independent Baptist churches, but any church that happens to be Baptistic, but where we align doctrinally, we're committed to the gospel and committed to church planting. That's what we do.
Well, you say a healthy missions organization, and then you said SBC in the same sentence. I'm not certain that those two things cohabitate. And I say that as someone who a couple of months ago hosted a live stream where I had a number of guys from the SBC on, Tom Buck, Tom Askell, William Wolf, and a few others. And we sat and talked about how messed up the SBC is. Because again, when I left When we moved to the South, we joined an SBC church because the denomination that I grew up in the Midwest didn't exist down here. And my older brother is still a SBC pastor. He was ordained in the SBC. So I still have tons of ties to the SBC. My heart still beats for my Baptist brethren. I desperately want to see them succeed. And because of the SBC size, they're kind of a bellwether for American Christianity. So no, I would love to see the International Mission Board, do better. I would love to see all of those things happen. So I'm encouraged by faithful organizations like the ABWE and any organization that has kind of such a robust starting. I'm in the PCA, and the PCA has a somewhat similar story. Now we're only about half as old. We've only been around about 52 years or so now, but it was the Southern Presbyterians. You were the Northern Baptists. We were the Southern Presbyterians. Same thing. They were going woke. They were going very liberal, and there were godly men who stood up and said, "No, we've tried to make amends. We've tried to call you to do better. You seemingly won't, and so we're going to go start our own thing." So there's something very kind of almost historically American about that, right? So it's an amazing thing when you hear about organizations that strike out on their own and then many decades later are still being faithful. I have kind of a general missions question. I went to a very missions minded Bible college back when I was a much younger man. I went to what back in those days was called Columbia Bible College in Columbia, South Carolina. It's now Columbia International University. And back in those days, and this was the late 90s and into the I left about 2000. So late 90s, I started in late 96. When you talked about foreign missions, and especially talked about kind of where God was needed the most. And again, that's kind of a weird thing to say. God is needed all over the place. Of course, the message of the gospel of Christ is needed everywhere. And sometimes I look at the West now and I go, especially here. But back in those days, they would talk about the 1040 window. Is that still kind of a thing in missions world?
Yes and no. And just to circle back to some things from a moment ago as well, we love our brothers and sisters within the SBC, and we have a number of SBC supporting and sending churches. I think what's happening through the International Mission Board is one of the wonderful bright spots within the SBC. But you're right. Anytime you have an organization that's that large, there is need for reform and for constant ongoing reform and returning to scripture in multiple ways. And the gentlemen you mentioned are friends of mine, and we can all look at our churches and see where we need to reform for sure. As to your question, I need you to restate it. Now I lost my train of
No
thought,
problem.
brother.
No problem at all. I was asking, is the 1040 window still kind of that was such a big deal 25 years ago?
Yeah,
And I'll let you explain kind of what the 1040 window even is, but
it
just kind
is,
of is that the
yeah,
thing?
yeah. No, and that's a good question. It is and it isn't. The 1040 window, if you were to get out your map and you remember, from, 10th grade geography class, latitude, longitudinal lines, and if you were to draw out that area, it would be an area rectangular that would mostly cover from North Africa across the Middle East, through Asia into the Pacific a little bit. But the idea within that window is where the highest concentration of unreached people groups reside. And we all throw around the term unreached people groups. Many of us do anyway, evangelicals in our churches. It means something very particular. It's a distinct, identifiable ethno-linguistic people group. So a distinct people unit marked by culture, language, ethnicity, nationality, religion, affinity, self-conception, all of those sorts of markers that allow us to say, okay, sociologically, this is a distinct people. And then numbering those peoples and looking at which ones are either less than 2% professing evangelical and less than 5% nominal Christian of any kind. Why that number? Well, it's a little bit arbitrary, but the logic is that if there's more than 2%, say, evangelicals among a population, then the chances of those believers being able to evangelize their neighbors, friends, kinsmen who speak the same language, think the same way, think in the same cultural terms as each other, the likelihood that they can successfully evangelize and see churches planted among people like them greatly increases. But below 2%, you're really talking about a minority so small that it can't successfully saturate that people group with the gospel. And so as we look at the world's thousands of people groups, and there's different numberings. I think 17,000 is one of the accepted numbers that's used. I think I've seen 14,000 as well, but there's about 7,000. I'm using very round figures that are considered unreached. And then there's probably another 2 or 3,000 that are considered unreached and unengaged, meaning there aren't any Christians among them. They don't have a Bible in their language. They don't have churches worshiping in their heart language, most likely. And we don't know of any missionaries that are currently trying to reach them. And again, the statistics aren't perfect at all, but that's generally how the story gets told in missions circles. And the 1040 window is that area where the most of those people groups tend to reside. So if you're familiar with the Joshua Project, you would see them on a map. If you were to plot them out, they would all tend to concentrate in places like North Africa and throughout the Islamic world and India and Southeast Asia, especially. The missions world, in some way, though, is moving beyond that paradigm. If you look at the mainstream broad missions world, and very broad, theologically broad, too broad for my comfort, they're focusing a little bit more on generational cohorts. They're thinking about how to reach people in urban centers. They're still thinking through the lens of globalization and global cities. And there's a lot of work to be done there. But I think what's being missed is still this focus on, okay, yes, but who are the language groups, especially, who've never heard the gospel, who, again, don't have the Bible in their language, probably have never heard a meaningful presentation of the good news of Jesus. And there's no church that they could visit, and there's no missionary that could speak to them in their heart language. Those are the people that we still need to focus on. And a good correction to the unreached people group or 1040 window kind of approach as far as emphasis goes is, yes, we need the tip of the spear going and reaching those unreached, unengaged people groups. But we also need to stay in people groups and ministering in places that we might consider quote unquote reached using those statistics, but we still need to stay there. We still need to disciple them, and we need to see them through to the point of maturity so that those churches are self-sustaining. It's not enough to go into a place and say, all right, well, now they're 3% believers. We can leave and go on to the next one. We need to stay in labor to see churches form that are healthy, that are going to survive for generations, that are rooted in sound doctrine, that have the resources to discern and push back error if error arises. You don't want heresy to overtake them in 1 or 2 generations. And so there is a more holistic view that's needed, and certainly one that's emerging in some parts of the mission world.
There's a lot to unpack there. And I'm grateful for your very precise interpretation of just kind of lingo. Defining terms is very important, because there's going to be a ton of people that watch that probably don't know what any of this inside baseball is. Maybe they've been on a local mission trip, maybe an overseas short-term mission trip. Maybe they support a missionary, maybe not. Maybe they don't know very much of anything about that particular world. But when you throw out a number like there's roughly 7,000 unreached people groups in 2025, that's a very jarring thing for a lot of folks to hear. When they think, I'm watching a podcast, I'm watching a YouTube channel right now, and certainly with this kind of technology and all of the stuff out there, how's this humanly possible? How is it possible that there are folks that still don't know, have never heard in their own language the simple gospel of Christ? And so it's a very telling thing to think that certainly what Christ said of it's the laborers that are few. My harvest is always out there. It's always white, ready to be harvested. It's laborers that are so few. That was true certainly in his day, and it's still true. And so I'm just amazed to think of how many people groups are still out there left unreached. And I live here, like I said, in just outside of the Charlotte area, down on the other side of Charlotte, I'm on the north side, and kind of down on the southeast side is a little town called Waxhaw, North Carolina. And in Waxhaw is the JARS Center, which stands for Jungle Aviation and Radio Service. It's part of the Wycliffe Bible Translators. And I spent a lot. I grew up down that way actually when we moved here from Indiana. And so that's in this county that I graduated high school in. I went to school at my Christian school with a lot of JARS kids, a lot of Wycliffe kids. And it, so I've always kind of had this tertiary, you know, friendship, knowledge of, like I said, I went to a very missions minded Bible college. One of my best friends there, who's still to this day one of my best friends, his parents were Wycliffe missionaries in Colombia, South America. I will never forget the day that we were riding in the car, heading to, I think Florida for vacation or something, he and I. And it was, since the apps now all come out, and he was on the U version Bible app, which everyone of course has on their phone. And he's scrolling through the languages, and he saw it. He saw the language, the kind of Indo Indian language, because they didn't just go to Colombia and mission to the Spanish speaking. That's
Mhm.
that's it. They had went to this very small tribal people who, like what you're talking about, didn't have the Bible in their own language, and his parents spent their lives translating scripture into this little tiny language. And I'll never forget, I just, by God's providential grace, I was with him when he first saw it on this app. And I mean, and he was just almost brought to tears of, this is my parents' life work. I mean, they spent their lives so that this can exist, so that those people can read the Bible in their language. And so what powerful work these men and women all over the world are doing, that especially if you're taking a language and literally putting it into syntax, putting it into writing for the first time. I mean, that's going to outlive you for generations, maybe for hundreds of years, maybe forever. The work you've put in is now making such a thing possible. So it's an incredible thing. Well, I want to shift our focus just slightly. And I say slightly because I think there's more connective tissue here than maybe a lot of people have put together, to some stuff that's going on here in our nation. But because we are a nation of immigrants, that's said often, obviously, by both political parties when it suits their needs, and because we are uh, dealing in our immediate zeitgeist, kind of what's going on right now in 2025, early April. You cannot turn on the news and not hear about some of the very aggressive deportation stuff that's happening under the current administration. And certainly some of the folks watching are going to go, yep, that's what I voted for. There's going to be others that watch and go, this is the worst thing that's ever happened. It's anti-American. It's immoral. It's ungodly. Can you give us a little bit of a missions overview
Mm.
of kind of how maybe we can think Christianly on maybe both sides of that topic?
Mm. I'll do my best. To understand missions, you have to understand a theology, a biblical theology of the nations. And as evangelicals, we have a very selective understanding of what a nation is. Some of us use it interchangeably with the word country, right? Or what today is really a nation state. These large blocks, the U.S., China. We think of those as nations, and in a sense they are, but biblically what's meant by nation, it goes back at least to the Tower of Babel. But I think even when we start at the Tower of Babel, we're missing an important fact. We think of the Tower of Babel, right? We think of God dividing people on earth into different languages, and so we tend to think, okay, so there's an element of judgment here. God doesn't want humanity in one homogenous clump. He wants them spread out in multiple ways, because if they were to unite in sinful rebellion, who knows what they'd be capable of doing? God says in that passage. But we tend to forget that it was God's will for them to disperse, and what He was doing at the Tower of Babel was ensuring that they would do that which He'd already commanded them to do, was to spread out, was to be fruitful and to multiply. I think we can look objectively at God's intention in the world and recognize that even without the fall, or even without the flood, the Tower of Babel, and these sorts of incidents in humanity's early history that we look at as crucial moments where we failed. Even without those decision points, in a perfect world, there would still be distinct peoples, groupings, cultures, dialects of language, because as people would spread out and be fruitful and multiply, they would be separated from one another geographically, and they would be exposed to different environmental conditions, and they would develop slightly different ways of thinking about those things. They would develop different lifestyles because of climate and terrain, and all of that adds up to the fact that the differences between nations and peoples, in a one hand, are all relative, right? Acts 17, from
Yeah.
one man, one nation, one blood, right? But from one man, God made all of the nations to dwell on earth. He's sovereign over their borders, their
Their
allotment,
habitations. That's right.
their
Yeah.
dwellings. Yes, but in another sense, those distinctions matter, and we know that they matter to God, and that they're not just a result of sin. Because when we look to the end of the book, when we look to Revelation 5:9 or 7:9, we see that around the throne are gathered every people, every tribe, every nation and tongue, and they seem to retain their distinctness in some way, even in the eternal state or in the eschaton. They're worshiping God as distinct peoples. God is glorified by the diversity of the orchestra, with all of the different
Yeah.
parts that each grouping is playing in that scene of cosmic worship to him. And so, starting with that understanding, then you realize nations develop organically throughout the biblical story. The families form extended families, which form clans, which form tribes, which compose nations. Now, today, we have these massive mega nations or empires or nation states, and some of those lines are blurred. And that's because of developments in the technology of government, where really, in order to hold together increasingly diverse groups of people, you sort of have to appeal to higher principles, to abstractions. And that's sort of where we are today, is you're seeing this tension between the particular and the local, between natural affections, love of one's own grouping of people, one's own nation, versus the values of kind of the modern liberal order of egalitarianism, of equality, of sameness, of equality of outcome, as well
Yeah.
as a number of other things. And so that's the inflection point that we're in right now. And I think it's important that we just recognize God dignifies nations in Scripture. And you can see, some are better than others. If they embrace the gospel, they're blessed. If they reject the gospel, they're cursed. And you see cultures that develop on a negative trajectory because of that. But God dignifies the concept of a nation, and so should we.
Yeah. That when we flatten things out that God doesn't, are we, and then because of our own misguided nobility, or what Joe Rigney would call toxic empathy,
Mm.
this concept of, well, but I'm nicer than God. And no one wants to say it that way, right? Yeah, I mean,
Mhm.
we all want to think, no, this, I'm the one interpreting scripture properly. You also mentioned earlier, and again, I've already said I'm in the PCA, and you mentioned earlier kind of the thrust of some of modern missions to these huge urban areas, and how that relates kind of to a PCA guy is, of course, until just a few years ago when he went on home to be with the Lord. And I will say, absolutely, I believe that he absolutely went on home to be with the Lord. I think Tim Keller was a saint and a godly man, and is with Christ. Um, though I have problems with some of the things that he espoused, and one of
Right.
them being that very idea of, that God seems to be more concerned about, these big mega urban areas, because again, it's just a numbers game. If you can, if
Yeah.
you can connect with the urban areas, you're going to get huge mass population, but you're also going to get, um and we see this in America. I don't know, again, I've not spent enough time overseas, though I have spent some. I've not spent enough time overseas to know if other countries struggle from this dialectic. I imagine they do, of kind of what in America we call flyover states versus, the coastal regions, which, win all of the sporting stuff. That's where all the really hip cool people are. It's where the money is. It's where the most popular universities, and outside of maybe Chicago seems to be like kind of the outlier in our nation. But outside of like Chicago, everything else is those coastal regions, and then
Mhm.
you've got all of those, knuckle draggers in the middle of the country that, just they don't know what's good for them. They need to just listen to the rest of us. and it's such a bizarre dynamic because it's not just about population centers at that point. Then you're talking it's kind of an oligarchy, of we know what's best, and if you'll just listen, then we'll kind of help you get there. But when I think about what you just articulated, um, really Old Testament and New Testament. Yet, like you said, you see it in Tower of Babel back in Genesis. You see it in Acts 17 when certainly Paul's at the Areopagus. Again in Revelation a number of times that Christ does not flatten these differences. He gave them to us, and he gives them unique nobility. And I think that that's such a beautiful thing that means, that a guy that works in a 30-story tower in downtown Manhattan and me who's sitting here north of Charlotte on a 15-acre farm where my daughter was literally wrangling one of our goats that got out earlier, those are both okay options. Those are both perfectly fine options. God's not going,
Actually, the way you describe it, I prefer the second option too. I think that's a lot closer to how we're made as creatures. But yeah,
I would tend to agree with you. So it's an amazing thing when we think through these things more. How do I want to say it? More than like one layer deep, right?
yeah,
I think the thing that and something else I want to kind of hone in on that you talked about, and I'd love to kind of hear you unpack this a little more. You talked about kind of the opposite of what I historically have called, and I even tell our people at our church, don't do these spiritual one night stands, or what I've historically called spiritual one night stands, where it's love them and leave them, drop Jesus on them like some atom bomb, and then
mhm,
just kind of, walk away as if that's an appropriate
right,
delivery mechanism of the
right,
gospel, and not some bastardization of the Great Commission where it's we are to teach them all that God has commanded us, and not just, you know give some weird gospel presentation and then leave. So can you unpack that a little bit more? What that looks like, say, certainly in the ABWE, but just from your mission philosophy, what does that mean to come alongside a person individually, or in your case, from a mission standpoint, maybe a group of people, and really help them, disciple them?
yeah. And I do want to show some of what you mentioned earlier. There is connective tissue between what you're describing now. How do you stay and disciple an individual, a group of people, a nation, since that's what we're called to make disciples of in the Great Commission is
Right.
to disciple the nations, right? There's connective tissue between that and the contemporary, even the political and the cultural discussion around what is a nation right now. And I just spoke with a missionary over the weekend. He is newly appointed with ABWE, but he's been serving for several years in North Africa. He told me the dramatic, very dramatic conversion story of an associate of his out of Islam to Christianity, and he was facing threats of murder, of honor killing from a member of his extended family. And so he, this new believer, was seeking to escape from his people group and his place and to go to another country, an ostensibly Christian country, in order to find refuge. And this missionary felt torn because he said, well, listen, I'm here because this country, this unreached people that we're ministering among, needs more Christians.
Yeah.
And if they're all leaving because of persecution, how will this people group ever be reached and discipled effectively? And so he wasn't necessarily too keen on just getting him out of the country. He wanted to get him to safety, but not necessarily completely out from among his own people. So on the one hand, in the States, we sort of say, we're we're all diverse, everybody's different, and you shouldn't love your heritage or your people too much because we know from the 20th century the negative places that goes. At the same time, when we get out on the mission field, we recognize, no, there is such a thing as responsibility and duty to one's people group to stay and disciple them. After all, that's what we want to do, is we want to lead locals among a people group to Christ so that they can be the conduit to reach their near neighbors, their kin, those that are like them. So we recognize there is a role that roots and rootedness and organic connection between peoples has in the task of the Great Commission. So for ABWE, what that looks like in part is our commitment to church planting.
Mm.
Yes, we don't believe in, despite our name, Association of Baptists for World Evangelism, We don't do that by airdropping tracts from the sky. I did just have lunch with a lady in our town who came to faith in Christ from reading a gospel tract, and praise God for that. But most people come to Christ through a relationship.
Yeah.
So evangelism is proclamational, yes, absolutely, but it's usually at least it's normative that somebody comes to faith in Christ not just through hearing the gospel proclaimed, but also through knowing a Christian and from hearing it proclaimed from a Christian who's present in their lives and who can not only bring them to embrace Christ by faith, but then stay with them, walk alongside them, and then ultimately bring them into the life of the local church. I'm fond of this quote from Cyprian, and I use it because it throws evangelicals off so much because we're so attuned against, this beast of organized religion and this medieval approach. But Cyprian of Carthage said that no one can call God his father who does not have the church as his mother. Now, whatever he meant by that, historically, right, we might be able to quibble with his ecclesiology compared to our own. But the point is, there's no such thing, at least biblically, as a Christian who isn't counted among God's people in the local church. On the day of Pentecost, it doesn't say 2,000 souls were saved. It says 2,000 souls were added. Added to what? The church, right? So to belong to Christ is to belong to his people. The two are inseparable from each other. So ABWE believes in staying not only to do the initial relationship building, not only to evangelize, not only to make disciples and teach continually what it means to follow Christ in all of his commands, but then to plant churches and then to stay involved in those churches, partnering and supporting and resourcing until local qualified men are raised up as elders, as pastors, and until those churches are mature enough to actually begin to send their own missionaries to continue the task. Only at that point in time do we begin to think, okay, now we can step a little bit back in this relationship. We're always afraid of paternalism. Well, nobody in missions today wants to be perceived as paternalistic, right? And it's true. You want to trust that God can work through these people, and you're not the savior. We aren't saviors. But Paul also says that you have many teachers, but not many fathers. And so while we reject the extremes of, paternalism, quote unquote, we do want to be parental and father people into not only the faith, but also the wholeness of what it means to apply all of Christ to all of life and to do so through the whole cycle of the church planting task.
That's a wonderful philosophy. That quote is one of my favorites because I tend to agree that, when you look, the further you go back into church history, the blurrier the lines get that we think are very comfortable lines. Well, I'm Protestant, I'm Orthodox, or I'm Catholic, or you start getting, the further you get back, those lines get very blurry. And you get back to the earliest of church fathers, and there wouldn't have been any separation from any of them. And I would tend to agree with that quote, though it is language that makes good Protestants uncomfortable. The ecclesiology of it is sound. That God didn't call any secret agents. I mean, you don't get to be the 007 of Christianity, where you're kind of infiltrating and going rogue, going solo. That it's a very symbiotic type of relationship.
Right.
And even when you get to the word ecclesiology or church, what is the ecclesia? It's the called out ones. And like you said, called out from what? Called out to what? Well, to fellowship, certainly fellowship with Christ, obviously, but also fellowship one with another. I mean, Hebrews is very very clear, don't forsake the assembling of one another. And so when you think about that, and then you kind of couple that, again, that connective tissue idea we were just talking about, you couple that with nations, peoples. It's an incredible thing that in any country that's going to be a multinational country, you're going to have churches of various different stripes. Yes, denominationally, but I don't even mean that. I mean, here in Charlotte, we have, Charlotte being kind of a microcosm of America, we have a ton of English speaking churches, but we have Russian churches, and we have Chinese churches, and we have, churches that would be Korean or speaking Farsi or any number of languages, all worshiping Christ, all meeting on usually Sunday. And doing so in a warp and a woof that feels familiar and comfortable, not only linguistically but culturally to the purview with which they're coming, coming to the table with. And I think that's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And then kind of on the heels of that, and again, I'm kind of keeping an eye on our time. I want to go about 10 more minutes and be respectful of your hard stop here. I was just watching Cross Politic last night. Obviously, it's a program that certainly you're familiar with. I know
Yeah.
that you know Gabe and some of those guys, and they were talking last night about this project that's coming up in Texas, and they called like Epic City or something. I think that's the name of it, and they were talking about how the project is to build a pretty homogenous Islamic community,
Mhm.
um, I want to say it's 40 or 50 miles outside of Dallas, and near Abbott, I think they said, Texas, and where the mosque would be in the center of the community. It'd be 1,000 or so homes, living units. And I mean, and if you're thinking 3, 4, 5 people per home, I mean, this is a decent sized community. You're talking 4,000, 5,000 people, all Muslim oriented. I think because of fair housing stuff. And they even talked about this a little bit last night. They probably can't get around fair housing and say it's Muslim only. But let's be honest, if it's going to have Sharia law and be Muslim focused, a lot of non-Muslims are not going to make this home, right? So what as Americans, when we think of commissional living, when we think of um, missional living, what as Americans and Christians can we do to kind of say the fact that in God's providence, he does allow a lot of people to come to America, even legally. Let's say illegal immigration is ended tomorrow, which never going to happen. But let's say it is. We still allow for a certain number of legal immigrants, roughly a million. Is usually about the number that this nation pushes for a year. So roughly a million legal immigrants a year from all over the world. Is there something both as a Christian and as an American that is okay, or maybe even more than okay, that is good to say, okay, we need to preserve American culture, American language, American religion, which I mean, again, this nation was certainly founded as a Christian nation. There's sadly a lot of proof that we've apostatized from that in great ways. But how do we think through that missionally, commissionally, but just Christianly?
Yeah. I was thinking about this a lot lately, and actually, I'm working on a project right now, a book treating two issues: the order of loves, the Ordo Amoris, that plays into this as well, right?
Yep.
In what order do I love people? Do I love my own before I love those that are unlike me? Those questions, and then the missionary task, and what is our obligation to the broader world, to the nations? And so, one of the results of that is I just published not but a week or two ago an article on Christ overall, on this topic, on Islam, immigration. What do we do with this? You've had some like Russell Moore over the years saying, well, Christians need to be in favor of Muslims building mosques, probably of communities like this as well that we're describing in Texas. What do we do with that? And I made these 4 points, and I'd love your thoughts on this as well. But one, yes, there's a missionary obligation that we have. Of course, if I have a neighbor who's from a non-Christian tradition, religion, pagan background, to the extent that the doors are open, that I'm able to communicate, I owe them the gospel in some sense. And so we can take advantage of those opportunities. And we can do that before we even begin to think about the broader politics of it, because this is a neighbor who's right in front of me. That's the first thing we can recognize. But the second thing is, we have been told that multiculturalism, immigration is always an intrinsic, unfettered good. And I would challenge that. I would say it's neutral. It can be good or bad, again, depending on the amount, depending on the context, depending on which culture is evangelizing which. I would say one culture is probably always evangelizing the other. It's pretty hard for two radically different cultures like that, a Western, generally broadly Christian consensus American culture, coexisting with an Islamic value set. One of those is evangelizing the other, but pretty unlikely that the two are going to relate in stasis forever. And so immigration being neutral, what do we do then? Well, I don't think that, and this is the next point in the article, I don't think that a strong, robust, Christian influenced or Christianized society, culture, Christian nation, whatever language you want to put to that. And we might have different ways of sketching that out, right? How much of that is enshrined in law versus how much of that is just culture and convention and custom and the effect of the church in people's lives. But a broadly Christian people, I don't think that them having a public profession of faith, a strong sense of their shared identity as a Christian people or nation, I don't think that's mutually exclusive with the missionary task or with reaching peoples who happen to be coming to us. I think oftentimes we're afraid of public Christianity because we think the effect of that is that we're automatically going to be at war with pagans worldwide, and I just don't think that the evangelists put it differently. I don't think that we're helping evangelism by pretending that secularism is sustainable. I don't think that submitting to a broadly secular order and not requiring governments, policies, officials in some way to submit to the lordship of Christ, I don't think that that's helping the evangelistic cause with peoples like this who do exist in our midst. And so I would say that what's necessary to sustain the missionary task is that the gospel continues to have its effect, continues to saturate nations and peoples, which does mean historically, you can look at this in the development of the missionary movement, especially since the mid 19th century. Strong Christian nations need to exist, and they need to be aware of their identity as strong Christian nations so that they can send, and so that even governments, rather than abusing far off peoples or getting entangled all the time in foreign wars and entanglements of various sorts, instead so that they can be aware that, hey, we exist for the interest of our own people and also to bless our own citizens who happen to be going out as missionaries into some of these places in the broader world. And so I think that we can love our neighbor, seek to reach Muslims with the gospel, but also be very suspicious and take a stand and say, no, we're not going to do this here. We're not going to have Sharia law in this place where we've covenanted with God to say that this is a Christian nation or people in some sense. And if it's not that, if it is a secular space, well, that's the problem as well. We've bowed the knee to this false religion of secularism, and we need to repent and return to the Lord. And you would never find that in most Islamic countries. These massive carve-outs for a completely Christian space. They would view that as some form of an infiltration. They wouldn't be wrong completely. So we can love and evangelize them while also being distinct and standing for Christian influence.
No, I think you're spot on there. The last time I'm kind of the associate pastor at my church. I preach once a month, and our head pastor does the other 3 Sundays. And so the last time that I preached, one of our members invited a friend of hers, happens to be her neighbor, happens to be Muslim. And so she had to go to her friend's husband and say, can she come to church with me? Because it's very patriarchal society, culture. He said, yes, you've shown yourself trustworthy. I trust you. She can go with you. Well, fast forward, she's now can't wait to come back to church. She'd never heard of a God like this God, and so we are praying heavily that this young woman and 4 young kids will come to Christ, and then her husband will have to be confronted with the gospel. And I mean, she would be taking a huge risk and a huge step to follow Christ. And again, historically speaking, that's not odd. I mean,
No.
the comfortability of following Christ here in America is actually what historically would be the odd thing. So I agree wholeheartedly. Where they are already here, currently residing, we owe them the gospel because we owe Christ our obedience first and foremost. And then part of that obedience is we owe them the gospel. But when I look at, again, I'll just take my own community. The Charlotte area is not growing as fast with Muslims as it is with Hindus. This community, the greater Charlotte area, is growing, I mean, by a factor of multiples every single year with the Hindu community. Indians are flooding into our area because banking and IT are the two biggest job sectors, and those are job sectors they seek. So I could drive anyone that comes to my community to 10 different neighborhoods in the greater Charlotte area, maybe now 20 different neighborhoods that are all Indian. I mean, every house in the neighborhood is lived in by a Hindu Indian family.
Mm,
What do we do with that? It's one thing to say that when I go to a movie theater now, say it's a multiplex movie theater in the greater Charlotte area, there's at least one or two, maybe three, depending on how many theaters they've got in this particular complex, that are always Bollywood film. So you can
mm,
start to see we're hitting a saturation point
mm,
that even the businesses around us are going, they're enough of a sector that we need to do something. But to your point, culturally speaking, religiously speaking, how do I, as a minister of the gospel in this community that is starting to have a real influx of Hinduism, how do we push back and say, we're happy you're here. We want to bring the gospel to you since you're here. However, they're building a giant Hindu church and school in, kind of the I want to say the eastern side of Charlotte. I mean,
mm.
huge campus, multi-million dollar project. Where do those two things meet? That's such an interesting thing for us to think through. And I think we do ourselves and our communities and our churches and probably just Christianity in general a disservice when we don't put the time and effort into thinking through them. When we just phone it in.
Yes, yes. So simple answers don't work. Both the simple answer of completely reject all foreign influence, well, that's not really a possibility in the current setup, or the simple answer of love and embrace every other cultural
Yeah.
influence. But, okay, but you have to have a distinct nation in some way. And so, how do you walk and chew gum at the same time? My contention has been over the last year or so, at least of this public discourse, that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can think in categories. Something can be a spiritual good, relatively speaking, in the providence of God, while not necessarily being a temporal or a national good. Take a look at just the many biblical examples, for instance, of suffering. Uh, Joseph's life, what his brothers meant for evil, God meant for good in Genesis
Mhm.
50, verse 20. And that includes everything. His enslavement and everything that happened to him after that, and even the famine in Egypt, all of those uh, harmful, detrimental, temporal, and national events were ultimately for the good of God's people, his covenant people. Um, and both of those can be true at the same time in different ways. There are examples in the Old Testament, and we're warned of this in Deuteronomy. Israel is told that if they're in rebellion against the Lord, one thing that will happen is that the foreigner will rise above them. They'll be
Yep.
infiltrated with foreign influence. The natural born people of that place will lose their place and lose their privilege. And I think for us, we can recognize it's not a good thing. It may even be judgment when the local people anywhere, but look at our country, when the local people are growing less and less educated, poorer, less and less healthy, taking less responsibility, living with less discipline, rejecting the Lord, and are losing influence and power and even an understanding of what it means to be a citizen and belong to a people, while the best and brightest from elsewhere in the world are coming in and are taking the reins. We can say, well, for the temporal good of
I think we lost Alex. It looks like I might have him back here.
ah,
Oh,
my
okay.
computer died. How do you like that? Yes.
No, no, that's okay. And I know we were coming up to your stop anyway. So I'd love to maybe in the coming weeks or months have you back on sometime because I really wanted to touch on kind of masculinity or the lack thereof of masculinity in missions. You'd mentioned way back, say 40 minutes ago or so, 45 minutes ago when we started, that you talked about how church planting was a big part of ABWE's mission. And of course, you mentioned elders. Well, those have to be male, and
Right.
and I know even at our church, a lot of the missions that we support through what we call MNW, which is Missions to the World, or MNA is Mission North America in the PCA. a lot of them are females, and so I'd love to have you back on sometime, Alex, and talk a little more about kind of the masculinity problem in missions, and just everything. You've been a wonderful guest. I want to thank you for your time today, and just your wealth of knowledge about not only the world of missions and kind of what ABWE's mission as an organization is, but I really appreciate your take on some of these a little bit more complex issues that the church is facing both here in America and abroad. So thank you so much for your expertise today. Thank you for your time. And I'd love to have you back on sometime to kind of explore some more.
Well, brother, I appreciate that. It's been a great conversation. I'd love to continue it as well. I apologize for the technology issues. That's not usually what happens. I usually have a much better studio set up than what I'm improvising today. But just to bring everything to a close, we can recognize God's sovereignty in bringing the nations to us. And we can still act in a way that accords with the temporal good of our own people. But we can do that also while loving the nations that the Lord's brought into our midst and trusting Him as we go out on mission. And I think it takes a level of discernment and nuance that's just not present. It's lacking greatly today in the online discourse. I think you see that. You recognize there's a lot of connective tissue between the cultural stuff, but then also what we know to be true about God's mission. And so, yeah, let's pick up the conversation at some point, brother. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Alex. God bless, brother.
Lord bless.
Bye bye.